Record, and we'll go ahead and we will get started. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first installment in our summer series on the Spanish period in Arizona. My name is Janie Adams. I'm the History Engagement Manager for the Arizona Historical Society. I'm also a staff historian, and I am the Associate Editor of the Journal of Arizona History. The Arizona Historical Society is a nonprofit educational and cultural institution, and we're a state agency, and we were established in 1864. AHS collects, preserves, and tells the stories of Arizona's past through museum exhibitions, libraries, collections, outreach, educational programming, and through publications. AHS preserves our past, shares our state stories, and connects people through the power of Arizona history. Support for this programming comes in part from membership dues, and if you would like to see more programming like this, consider becoming a member of the Arizona Historical Society. Members get free admission to the Historical Society museums. They get special member-only events and member pricing for programs, print copies of the Journal of Arizona History, and so much more. And if you're interested in becoming a member or learning more about all of the different things that we do at the Arizona Historical Society, you can visit us online, you can sign up for our email list, you can follow us on social media, or you can explore one of our museums. And you can learn about all the things that we do at azhs.org. Some helpful reminders for this session. This is a Zoom webinar, so the panelists and hosts can't hear or see you. So you can use the Q&A feature, or you can use the chat, I believe, for questions and comments. This program will be recorded, and it will be available on our YouTube channel, hopefully in a couple of weeks. And if you enjoy this kind of programming, consider becoming a member of the Arizona Historical Society. The next talk in our series is actually just in a couple of weeks on the 24th of June, same time, same place. If you're interested in registering for this program, I've put a QR code up here. I'm going to linger for a minute so everyone's got their smartphones out and can scan the QR code. If you don't have your smartphone handy, no problem. Information about this program and all the other programs in this series is available online on our website, azhs.org. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Dr. Andrés Reséndez. And unfortunately, I have set up my screen in a way where I can't see my bio. But Dr. Reséndez, you are at the University of California at Davis, correct?
Correct.
And your current work is looking kind of at the Pacific Ocean trade networks and how the Pacific Ocean is kind of this conduit connecting North America to places beyond, correct?
Correct.
All right, well, I'll let you tell us more about that, and I'm going to stop sharing our screen.
All right, thank you so much, Janie. First of all, it's a pleasure. Thank you for this invitation, and thank you all who are participating in this session. What I will be presenting is work in progress in some big ideas. And let me just first take a minute to hopefully get my PowerPoint going. Here it is. Okay. So, So first of all, I should say that the original title of my presentation is about the Chinese sink and the Southwest. And I assume, but I'm not sure whether you ever get any talks about China proper, not the Chinese in the Southwest, but China itself in the Arizona Historical Society. But I would like to sketch out why this may be important. And before I start with this, I want to say a few things about the ideas behind this and the impetus for this research. So this came about as a result of an idea of bringing together a group of historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, and others who are interested in the very early 16th, 17th century kind of stuff, where sometimes it is difficult to get documentation, or it is difficult to know exactly what happens. And for that, the central theme, the central idea was this idea of a predatory landscape, or landscape of predation, landscapes of predation. This idea was to be discussed by a number of historians and, as I said, scholars of various tribes, archaeologists, etc., from different walks of life, and engage in different types of research, some of them working on Vikings in England, Amazonian indigenous peoples, Mississippian societies and coalescence, etc. And originally, this conference was going to take place in 2020 in Meknes, Morocco, and you can see an attractive picture of that place. But because of the pandemic, 2020, we postponed, and eventually we ended up 2 years later having that gathering in Chicago in March of 2022. So quite a change of venue, as you would imagine. And then, luckily, we were selected to continue further our discussions about this idea of landscapes of predation at the Amerind Institute in Dragoon, Arizona. So lots of local connections to what I'm about to say in the next talk about in the next few minutes. So first, let me just say that a predatory landscape is a landscape that lends itself to a variety of activities that include but are not limited to enslavement and captivity, exploitation of resources, murder, genocide, dispossession of land, destruction of property, crops, etc., looting and plunder, and a large, etc. So these are the types of activities that you can see through the archaeological record or through the historical record, and that we were very interested that have occurred all over in the Viking era in England, or you can see that in the Amazons, or you can see that in what is now the American Southwest. These behaviors from the part of an invading or an outsider group elicit responses from the people already living in these places, and that includes, but again, are not limited to, things like dispersion or increased mobility or strategic collaboration with the colonizers, or coalescence, the forming of larger groups from smaller ones, rebellions, and counter-predation. So what I will talk about is the series of rebellions that took place, of course, the Pueblo Revolt, which is the main one, but others that took place in these landscape of predation, as I would like to characterize these larger area of northern Mexico and the American Southwest in light of the moving mining frontier. So that's where the mining, and then eventually that's where China come into play in these particular presentation. Of course, I have to start with the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which will be very familiar to many of you, but nonetheless, I would like to just set the scene there. When in the spring of 1680, the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico devised this very audacious plan of liberation. And the Pueblo back then, in the late 17th century, consisted of some 70 settled self-contained communities scattered throughout New Mexico and Arizona. And each Pueblo, not all of them participated, but the ones that participated agreed that they would rise up in arms on the same day and kill all its Spanish authorities, friars, etc., in one massive insurrection. The rebels' greatest strategic insight was that all or nearly all of the pueblos should act simultaneously. If they could marshal their vast numerical superiority, pueblos would be able to dislodge the Spanish rather easily. In 1680, there were about 2,000 Spanish colonists scattered throughout New Mexico. It had been a backwater area where no silver or other precious metals were found back in the late 17th century. There were also about perhaps 3,000 if we add their indigenous and mestizo dependents, so 3,000 in this large area. And these few Spanish settlers lived in the middle of some 17,000 Pueblo Indians, thousands more if we count Apaches, Utes, Navajos, Mansos, and other indigenous peoples who lived in the area and had some fluid trade and other human interactions with the Pueblo Indians. So this is how this movement arose. I won't go into the details of the Pueblo Revolt, except to say that the revolt was a resounding success. As you know, on August 10 and 11 of 1680, the revolt swept through the kingdom of New Mexico, destroying houses, ranches, churches, and annihilating the Spanish people who lived there. There was a focus in the destruction. They razed churches, desecrated churches. They destroyed many of the Christian paraphernalia, and within a few weeks, all of the Spanish residents who were, or nearly all, practically all of them who were living there, had been pushed back into what is now northern Mexico. Now, the Spanish, there are many reasons why the Pueblo Indians rose so successfully at that time. But I would like to briefly discuss many different possibilities. So one possibility, of course, is that, first of all, we need to consider that the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 is not an isolated event. Even though it tends to be presented as an extraordinary, unique event, and certainly it was unique in terms of its scope, its magnitude. But nonetheless, if we look more broadly at the region, and especially if we can for a moment forget that there is an international line dividing Mexico and the United States today, and if we go back to the 17th century, we can see that the revolt that occurred in New Mexico and Arizona is part of a larger canvas of 17th century revolts. So basically, these revolts originated, these were motivated by groups that had previously been pledged allegiance to the Spanish crown, but nonetheless, some years, months, or decades later, they decided to rise up against the very Spanish that they had pledged to be a part of, the Spanish Empire that they had pledged to be a part of. And so you can see those from the Acashis in 1601, the Xiximes, the Tepehuanes, Tobosos, Salineros, etc. So you can see that this is a large canvas, and basically European intrusion into the indigenous homelands and hunting grounds of many of these peoples constitutes a very general way of explaining these rebellions. And more specifically, the mining economy of northern Mexico expanded at a furious pace during the 17th century as prospectors made silver strikes, attracting thousands of migrants from central Mexico into these northern regions. And the mines, of course, never sprang up alone because they had to be supplied with food, timber, leather, salt, and coal, and many other products. These mines originated an ecosystem around them, an ecology, if you will, of settlements that included haciendas, livestock ranches, timber camps, salt pits, carboneras, or charcoal producing fields, and others. And of course, these new human settlements ended up encroaching on native hunting grounds and introduced invasive species, particularly cattle, which really did very well on the grasslands of northern Mexico. And it transformed, it disrupted lifeways, native lifeways in many ways, and it also opened other avenues of adaptation to the indigenous peoples who live there. So 17th century rebels cited encroachment. If we go through these list of rebellions, including the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, we will see that some of the rebels made the case that they were dispossessed of their land, and that was one of the reasons for their rising up. But it is easy to really overstate the case for land dispossession. The indigenous population of northern Mexico actually declined through the 16th and 17th centuries, and these reduced population fell to less than 500,000 people during the second half of the 17th century, which was sprinkled over more than 3 million square kilometers. So even if we consider the multiplication of the mines and the rapid expansion of the cattle ranches, the population density of this vast region fell to less than 2 persons per square kilometer. So again, very low human density. So understandably, the most common indigenous strategy to cope with Spanish occupation was to relocate to more distant or inaccessible places. Nomadic and semi-agricultural peoples could accomplish this without really great disruptions. But even settled and fully agricultural communities moved and relocated in the face of Spanish pressure, as recent archaeological and anthropological research has demonstrated, for example, for the case of New Mexico. These findings should give us at least some pause in thinking that land dispossession was the root of this conflict between Europeans and Native Americans. Something similar could be said with respect to the introduction of cattle. If it was disruptive in the sense that it drove many other animals like deer and destroyed plants on which some indigenous groups subsisted, but these ungulates themselves became a valuable source of food and high protein food. Cows and pigs became the new deer, while horses extended the hunting ranges of some of the indigenous groups who took to the horses. So in short, land encroachment and invasive species were, even though they were cited in these rebellions, it's difficult to see exactly how these were the driving forces for insurrection. Another possibility, of course, and these are some of the places that we are talking about initially, some of the 17th century rebellions are taking place in northern Mexico and are gradually moving north until finally engulfing New Mexico and Arizona into this rebellious wave that I showed you in the table before. Epidemic famines constituted another possibility, but again, epidemics can be easily, let me see here, can be easily overstated as well. For example, here, this table reveals the 6 of the 10 rebellions coincided with significant episodes of epidemics and/or famines. So here are the same list of rebellions, and then to the right of the years, you have the epidemics that existed. So in some cases, the natural disasters preceded the outbreak of the rebellion and clearly played a role in the deliberations of the rebels. The Acashis, Shishimes, and Tepehuanes all wrestled with several bouts of epidemic disease in the years leading to their respective uprisings. And all 3 of these groups singled out epidemic disease as one of their grievances. In other cases, epidemics and famines occurred not before, but during or after the insurrection. For instance, the Tarahumara rebellion of 1690 unleashed such a prolonged famine and devastating illness that at the end of 1692, far from encouraging further conflict, in fact, it brought it to an end. The table also shows, of course, that 4 out of the 10 insurrections had little to do with epidemics. There is no obvious link between, or automatic link, at least, between epidemic and famines or disease. New Mexico's case suggests that this relation is problematic. So here we have, what I'm showing you here is a few estimates of the Pueblo population during the 17th century, which indicate a substantial population loss in the decades between 1620 and 1640, when the province is generally thought to be more or less at peace. And conversely, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 occurred after 4 decades of relative, and the operative word here is relative, demographic stability. So I'm not ready to hang my hat on these figures because they are few and far on between, but at the very least, they don't provide a very clear support for the idea that famine is what drove these rebellions. And of course, religious strife is yet another factor. And I don't want to belabor the point. I do want to believe that religious strife was certainly a main way in which this clash expressed itself. Certainly, indigenous people had some beliefs about how the cosmos worked. They had some beliefs about the supernatural and the spiritual world, and that those beliefs clashed very clearly with the Christian beliefs of the Spanish conquistadors and the Spanish settlers of the 16th and 17th centuries. And so in a very real sense, there was a clash of worldviews and a religious clash between these two peoples. Specifically, Spanish waged war against these indigenous beliefs, and they often, simply said that these beliefs that they had were the works of the devil or the works of witches, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea was that the Spanish justified these by saying that just like women were weaker than men, so indigenous peoples were weaker than Europeans, and the devil preyed on these weaker people. And so because of that, they were more susceptible to the wiles of the devil. And we again see these this theme being reproduced in many of the 17th century rebellions that I listed before. So for example, these old Indians were the principal instigators of the uprising. This is a quote from a Jesuit who, with regard to the Akashi rebellion of 1601, because by means of a diabolical spell, they made their people believe the Christian Spaniards were against them. Similarly, meditating about the causes of the uprising of the Akashis, Shishimes, Tepehuanes, Tarahumaras, and others, priest Diego de Medrano of Durango had little doubt that the Indians, and I quote, are subject to the influences of shamans, instruments of the devil, who incite their listeners to rebel and commit atrocities, end of quote. So religion undoubtedly played a significant role in driving these uprisings. But the cause that seems to me a very powerful one, and one that jives very well with the timing and what happened in these rebellions, is of course the issue of labor coercion, which is again mentioned in the literature, but it is also mentioned in all of these rebellions, 17th century rebellions, including the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. Besides religious conflict, this is the only other indigenous grievance that looms in every single uprising. Every mining, ranching center of northern Mexico required hundreds of workers to function, And unfortunately, labor was extremely difficult to come by in what is now northern Mexico and the American Southwest. And a closer look at how these economy became integrated into the colonial economy of central Mexico and into the economy of the Pacific and Europe will assist us in understanding why the pressure was so strong. And this is really so. Spaniards found no silver or gold or any marketable agricultural commodities in New Mexico, but they did they did have a substantial population that could easily become integrated into an economy that was developing further just to the south. So first of all, I want to say that Spaniards came to the New World with the idea of exploiting natural resources as well as settling. There was an initial phase of gold in the Caribbean, and there was also an initial phase of gold in central Mexico. But these really gave way to a much larger, much more substantial wave of silver extraction, as all of you will be very familiar with. This map that I'm showing you here is one of the, it's a fairly comprehensive map with the mining centers found in what is now Mexico in the 17th, in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, marked with different little markings. So the 16th century mines are marked with a little triangle. I wonder if you are able to see that little square for the 17th century mines and a little circle on about the 18th century mines. So you can see it's a pretty significant mining landscape, silver mining landscape. These mining landscape is what I would suggest to you generated these landscape of predation in many parts of Mexico, and especially in what is now northern Mexico, where some of the largest mines ultimately were developed. Now, these mines, interestingly, began. I mean, we often talk about the silver mines in very broad terms. But these silver mines, actually the earliest silver mines, began in a region just to the south of Mexico City that was known to the early conquistadors, including Hernán Cortés, as the Sierra of the Silver, or sometimes the Silver Province. And this is a story that is seldom understood very well. Normally when we talk about Hernán Cortés, we talk about him in terms as the conqueror of Mexico, the Spanish conquistador who led the campaigns that toppled the Aztec Empire and the city of Tenochtitlan in the summer of 1521. And there the story ends. But Hernán Cortés had a second career as a mining baron as well as a Pacific explorer. And this second career is sometimes completely forgotten. So Hernán Cortés had gone to Mexico not to topple indigenous empires, but to get some precious metals. Just how focused on this he was is very evident in many things he did and many things he said. So, for example, on the road from the coast of Mexico, from Veracruz to Mexico City, he started exchanging messages with Moctezuma. And one of the things it is known that he said is that he sent word to the great Aztec Huaytlatuani that the Spanish suffered from an illness of the heart that could only be cured with gold. So please send some gold. So that was very clear. And of course, it is well known that once the Tenochtitlan fell into his hands and he captured the last Aztec Huaytlatuani, so Cuauhtemoc, that he had him tortured by burning his feet and hand in order to reveal the whereabouts of the treasure that they were supposed to be hiding, that the Aztecs were supposed to be hiding. So again, all of these actions betray his incredible determination to get what he wanted. And even after the sacking of Tenochtitlan, that was not enough for Cortés and his close lieutenants. So he, ever since landing in Mexico, but even later on, he continued to question indigenous informants about the sources of the gold and silver, and that's how he ended up learning about these Sierra of the Silver just to the south of Mexico City. So very quickly, he gained a foothold into this region. He developed no less than 30 mines to his name. I mean, part owner or whole owner of 30 mines in this region, according to a list from 1549. These, even though many historians believe that this was not such a huge development. I mean, these silver mines pale in comparison with what would later be the mines of Zacatecas or Guanajuato, and especially with the mines of Potosí in what is now Bolivia. This may be so in the longer scale of time, but in the 16th century, the silver province remained a very significant silver producing region of Mexico, up there with Zacatecas, etc. And the silver province also had the advantage of being right on the way from Mexico City to the Pacific coast, especially the port of Acapulco, and before that, the port of Zacatula, which is a little further north from Acapulco, also on the Pacific coast, where Cortés started developing some fleets. So again, apart from developing these, and I don't want to get too carried away, I want to leave some time for questions, but in addition to being bent on finding precious metals, which is what he had come to, he also had a second goal, which was to find the best approaches to the Pacific Ocean, which was called the South Sea at the time. And he intended to build ships and to send those ships to the Far East. So again, these may seem to you like a very bold, like a very audacious kind of a scheme. But if you remember, this was the original plan of Columbus, which was to sail to the east by way of the west, as he put it so eloquently. And even decades later, at the time of Hernán Cortés, these overriding objective remained very much alive. So just as Cortés was marching up to Mexico City, Magellan was finding the strait that bears his name, and he was sailing to the Philippine Islands in one swoop for the first time in recorded history. So this idea of building ships on the western coast of the Americas and then making their way across to the Far East, to the Orient, to the fabled Orient with its enormous riches in precious spices, but also in silk and porcelain, etc., was a major objective, and it remained a major objective of Cortés and his men. So all of that to say that Cortés and his silver mines, this second career of Cortés, really set the stage for some of the rebellions that we've been discussing in the 17th century, far to the north of Mexico. And before we leave, I should just say one more thing about the business of silver mining. So, which is fairly well established. So the business of silver is probably the first global business in the sense that all 5 continents were involved in this, meaning here you have the largest silver deposits in the world that were sitting in the Americas. So just to give you a sense, between 1500 and 1800, roughly about 80% of all the silver extracted on Earth originated in the American continent. So 8 out of 10 kilos or 8 out of 10 pounds originated in the American continent. And they went largely to Eurasia. So Eurasia functioned with some gold coins, but primarily with silver coins. And by Eurasia, I mean Europe, since Roman times and in medieval times, etc. Central Europe was a major site of silver production, and silver coins circulated in Europe. The same thing went in the Middle East. India operated with a variety of coins, but many of them were silver. Some of the most valuable were silver. And China was also a big user of silver. So again, there were silver coins in all of these places, but silver is, I mean, there were gold coins in all of these places, but gold is, even though it's more valuable than silver, is a lot more rare than silver. It is very, very soft. So it's not as practical as silver, which is far more abundant and far harder than gold. And so it is not surprising that silver would become, of the two precious metals, the dominant way used as a means of exchange and store of value. China is a case apart because China was by far the largest market for silver in the world. So just to give you a sense, in 1500, China represented about 25% of the world's population. So 1 out of every 4 people living at that time in 1500 were living within what is now China. So larger, even a larger share than today. Today, China represents about 17 or 18% of the world's population. So the relative weight of China back then, relative to the rest of the world, was even bigger than today. And China, these large group of people wanted silver all of a sudden in the 15th and the 16th century. And this happened because China had been one of the first societies to operate on paper money. But of course, the Chinese governments succumbed to the temptation of printing too much paper money, and people lost confidence. It led to hyperinflation in the 14th and 15th centuries, and people, rationally dumped the script and took refuge in valuable commodities, especially silver. So all of a sudden, in the 15th and 16th century, China needed all the silver it could get. China had some silver mines that supported its initial silverization, but it didn't have nearly enough to sustain its currency needs in the longer term. And so China turned around to the rest of the world to get as much silver as it could get. It first turned to Japan. There were some silver mines developed in Japan since the 1520s, and there was a very significant silver trade between Japan and China. And ultimately, it reached into the American continent, which, as I said, produced 80% of all the silver produced in the world between 1500 and 1800. And China was by far the largest market. So this silver flowed in 2 ways, across the Atlantic and through further European intermediation, especially British and Dutch. It went to India and then ultimately to China, or directly across the Pacific through the Manila Galleon and other trans-Pacific merchants. So this is how these enormous pressure from China is what's driving some of the mining activities that are occurring, well, in the Americas, and more specifically for our context, in northern Mexico and in the American Southwest. So I will just wrap this up and leave some time for questions, to say that that New Mexico became integrated into this larger silver economy as a net exporter of slave-made goods. So although it is very difficult to estimate New Mexico's overall export and the number of Indian slaves shipped out of the province, in the decades before the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, there is considerable impressionistic evidence about the revolt. So here we have, first of all, if we look at the baptism records, we find that many of these indigenous peoples from the Kingdom of New Mexico wind up in Parral, which is so this is the mine that is in what is now southern Chihuahua. You can see that at the southern, at the lower part of that map. And you can see how the number of indigenous peoples from New Mexico baptized in Parral increased, especially in the 1660s and especially in the 1670s, in the years leading up to the Pueblo revolt. So again, the number of captives. So there's no other reason for natives from New Mexico to wind up as in the archives, in the parish archives of Parral, of this mining center, other than that they were transported there and sold as slaves in this mining center. And of course, what went on in Parral went on in many other mining centers that are far less well documented than Parral. So again, the timing works very well. This rebellion, this massive rebellion, created a landscape of predation that expanded not only into New Mexico and into Arizona, but also into the western areas, into the Sinaloa and Sonora areas. And again, if you compare a map, even though it's called the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, the number of indigenous peoples who participated in this massive insurrection included many other peoples: Apaches, Mansos, Tobosos, Pimas, and others from different parts. And you can see, as in this map, you can see the correspondence between what I call the corridors of enslavement leading from these regions to the mines of Parral, and a shaded area which corresponds to the area that was in turmoil in the 1680s. So I will stop here, and I will leave some time for any questions or comments. So I will stop sharing my presentation here. And I see that there are some chat questions. Okay. Okay, just give me a second. Oh, China is Arizona's third largest trading partner, of course. Okay. Okay, difficult to hear. I'm sorry. Were you able to hear me? Okay. Okay.
I was.
Okay. So apologies for that if there was any problem. There was no Albuquerque in 1680, of course. Yeah. I just included that as a general reference. China started buying vast amounts of copper. Yeah. Yeah, that's of course, copper was later discovered in the region, and China, of course, was also a market for copper. Okay, you have used some terms that I would say are controversial. Using rebellion and pledge to the Spanish stand out to me. Okay, okay, pledge to the Spanish. So yes, I did use the pledge to the Spanish. And I guess it harks back to the very legalistic early colonial document, the requerimiento, which was a legal document drawn up in Spain, and it was supposed to be read aloud to native peoples, telling them that to submit to the Spanish crown, or else they would be attacked by the Spanish forces. They were supposed to be read through translators, but often the document was simply read in Spanish. If it was read at all, it was clearly a legal subterfuge in order to take possession of the Americas. And, if you read the document, it says that basically the Pope granted these lands to the Spanish kings, and the Spanish kings are going to honor these grant by the Pope, who is the greatest king that exists in the world. So it's a very legal, it's like a legal brief. And so I use the term pledge in the sense that whether they pledged or not, this is the document that at least in theory, were presented to them. And this is the basis on which they were at least nominally under the Spanish Empire. And this is the pledge that I claim to have, they broke in rebellion. But of course, it makes perfect sense to I mean, I agree that it was a subterfuge. Basically, this was dispossession, and of course, I understand why these would be controversial from a native point of view. I mean, some natives in Venezuela, for example, claim that, well, the Pope must have been drunk to be giving up land that did not belong to him, and that was obviously the sensible thing to think. Why would we be subjected to the authority of the Pope? Anyways, he's never been around here. So, yes.
So there are some other questions. So I'll just start with the first one, and it is, to what degree did Cortez's mines originate as areas of indigenous exploitation?
Oh, this is something that I've been looking at deeply these past few weeks. Even in an era where the exploitation of native peoples was pretty common, the silver mines of the Sierra of the Silver were notorious for the abuse. There were a few more or less voluntary workers known as naborias, but the vast majority of the digging and the refining, etc., was done by compelled peoples of three kinds. So there were a few African slaves imported, which already gives you a sense of just how global this business was, that Hernán Cortés in the 1520s and 1530s is already importing Africans from halfway around the world in order to work his mines. Second of all, they are being worked by Indian encomiendas. So this is a figure of a labor arrangement devised by the Spanish crown, which crown that was not supposed to be slavery, but often in this case it was used as slavery in all but name. And the third was by slaves, probably the most abundant category, indigenous slaves who had been taken in the initial conquest of Mexico, or had been purchased from indigenous slaveholders in central Mexico in subsequent years, or procured in other provinces in which the Spanish continued to conduct campaigns, years or even decades after the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521. So yes, this was a landscape of predation writ large. I mean, I could go on and on, but yeah.
A couple related questions to that. What percentage of people working in these mines were enslaved? It seems like the majority from what you've just said.
Yeah, well, again, the percentages, of course, vary from mine to mine and vary from era to era. So if we talk, for example, about the Silver Province from the 1520s to the 1550s, so the first 30 years, I would say that it's the overwhelming majority. As I said, there were a few semi-voluntary, and let me just unpack, just to give you a sense of what this meant. These naborias, again, the term comes from the Caribbean, it's from the Caribbean experience. They were attached for life to a Spanish overlord, but they were distinguished from Indian slaves in that they could not be legally bought and sold. So the only difference, so they were both compelled and they were forced to work, but the only difference between the naborias, which were considered voluntary workers, and the Indian slaves, was that they could not be bought and sold. The same thing goes for the encomienda Indians. They were not supposed to first of all, they were not supposed to be involved in mining activities, because sad experience from the Caribbean had shown that the Indians were not cut out. That's what the Spanish called for mining work, because they would commit suicide because they could not tolerate the hard work of the mines in the Caribbean, and therefore using encomienda Indians directly in mining operations was against the law. Yet they were usually in these silver mines in the Silver Province. They were used as such. Many encomienda owners, so the Spanish overlords who owned the encomiendas, rented out their encomienda Indians for periods ranging from 1 month to 1 year the silver miners of the silver province. So so again, very, very clear pattern there.
And then a kind of another question related to that later on in kind of the history of enslavement and enslaved peoples in New Spain. Did did enslaved indigenous peoples have any kind of interaction with enslaved African peoples?
Yeah. Well, they lived side by side. They worked side by side, and they often, had relations with each other. So this is in the silver province, it is quite fascinating because African slaves were far more expensive. Of course, they had come all the way from Africa. They were often had some prior metallurgical knowledge that they had acquired either in Africa or in their Caribbean experience. So many of these African slaves were, and I'm talking about in the 1530s, very early on, 1540s, where there are notarial records that mention these African slaves. You can see that many of them are being deployed in more specialized tasks involving refining of the silver, or involved in things like manufacturing tools, rather than in the riskier and more common work of just carrying ore from the mines to the mill or to the refining areas, which was by far the most difficult one, because it was the one that was done by the slaves. And mind you, the slaves were both men and women. And if you look at the regulations, one of the regulations, one visit by a high-ranking Mexico City official said, well, perhaps we should exclude the pregnant women from carrying ore because experience has shown that they lost their babies. And so as a matter of better business practice, perhaps we should exclude them from carrying ore. But that gives you a sense of these were very young, of both sexes. And the indigenous peoples often were married. They had established relationships between them before enslavement or after they had been organized in working gangs known as cuadrillas. But some of them did have relationships with the African slaves who were right there also in the side, working side by side.
Okay, so one more question on this topic, and then we'll change gears a little bit. Could you comment on differences between the policy of the Spanish crown regarding indigenous labor and how it was actually exploited by Spanish mine operators? Particularly, this asker is interested in the northern frontier of New Spain.
Yeah. So I guess let me try to understand the question. So the question is whether the use of indigenous slaves was different in mining than in other Spanish activities. Is that the question?
I think it has more to do, it says the differences between the policy of the crown
Oh,
and then maybe what actually happened on the ground.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah. So of course, the crown was very conflicted about how to extract the silver that was obviously in great demand in Eurasia. And it was obviously very profitable for the Spanish crown. The Spanish crown lived off of the silver. So just to give you to put it in broader perspective, the Spanish crown was ruled by the Habsburg that have had possessions in Central Europe, which was the source of the German silver mines. And already the Habsburg had this prior experience going back to the 14th, 15th centuries especially 15th centuries, where these mines became very productive, the late 15th centuries. And of course, they wanted to do the same in the New World. On the other hand, the Spanish royals, the Spanish kings and queens did have some sense and some reports that abuses were being committed against indigenous peoples, and the Spanish crown early on outlawed Indian slavery. You know, this happened just as the silver province is getting off the ground. So this adds another complication, but the Spanish crown abolished Indian slavery under all circumstances in 1542. So after a few years of using them. And of course, the owners and the silver mine owners complained and that this would result in the complete devastation of these, wiping out of these businesses, and possibly in the loss of these colonies that were so much enriching Spain itself. The result was a very complicated story, which is this, you know, it's another book that I wrote, which is that the owners resorted to a subterfuge in order to get around the prohibition, but continue doing it under different names, etc. So basically they went underground. But this is sort of the general panorama that we see in the Spanish policy that theoretically did not, you know, prohibited Indian slavery in all circumstances, and the reality on the ground, which was that it occurred in many different guises and in many different businesses.
So changing gears a little bit, were the Spanish the primary silver trading partners for China, or was there an intermediary party? And then another question asks kind of what's the impact of all of that silver in China?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, these are huge questions. So yes, as I just explained, the majority of the silver extracted in the world came from the New World mines. And by far, the largest importer of silver was China. China could have, so here's the reality is that China being 25% of the world, and by the way, that percentage increased over time. So 25% in 1500. By 1800, so 300 years later, it was close to 36% of the world's population. So 1 out of every 3 humans alive were in China. So it went from one of every 4 to 1 of every 3 humans alive. So what China wanted, China sent ripples throughout the rest of the world. And China wanted silver. So the silver came overwhelmingly from the New World. In the case of in the case of China, they became hostage to the providers of silver. So they didn't have silver to power their economy, as I explained. So they had to get it from the outside. And so they got it first through multiple parties. So they got it, some of it came straight across the Pacific. So some of the silver was shipped out of Acapulco, ended up in Manila, which was the Spanish only colony in Asia. And Manila was visited by thousands of Chinese merchants that essentially provided all kinds of things to be traded across the Pacific in exchange for silver. So this is what sustained the Manila Galleon, the silver flowing right across the Pacific. But probably the majority of silver went via the Atlantic, so out of Veracruz, etc., to Spain. And from Spain engaged in all kinds of expensive wars, incurred all kinds of debts with various merchants, and it paid in American silver. And this silver went to other countries, especially the Netherlands and England. And these were the guys who then took it to India and China. So Dutch and English, and to a lesser extent French merchants were involved in the Chinese trade, and that was another way in which these American silver ended up in China as well. So and I've been talking mostly about China. India was a distant second, but India was also another very large market for silver that was also significant. So this is basically how it worked out. What happened to China in the long term? Well, in the long term, it became dependent on on American silver. And you might be, or some of the people attending the seminar might be interested. And I can see that it's already one, so I'll finish here. That the United States, early on in the early 19th century, as the Spanish Empire collapsed, succeeded the Spanish as the largest provider of silver to China. So these are northeastern merchants, especially from Boston, that went to Spanish ports, loaded up silver coins, and took them to China. And so they became these Bostonians and we're talking about the 1790s or early 1800s, became the largest providers of silver to China. And many Chinese complained that they had fallen, they had become dependent on these American merchants bringing all these silver from the American continent.
Dr. Reséndez, thank you so much. I think for a lot of us, we're kind of taught that the first interaction between, North America and China is the open door policy in the 19th century. But this is just so illuminating for a deeper history of kind of that trade and understanding why these silver mines are developed in New Spain in the first place. So thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Bye, everyone. Take care.